I thought we were gonna have to like sit.
I know, like
Folded legs.
crisscross on the stage.
Crisscross applesauce.
But we have chairs. Well, thank you so much all for being here. And thank you, David, for writing this book and giving me a chance to talk about it. I loved reading this so much. I loved it so much. I have 3 copies. And I wanted to start with one of the aspects of the book that I think I found unexpected, which is that Dirtbag Billionaire is sort of a leadership study almost. Like it's an exploration of a really kind of singular and complex business leader, Yvon Chouinard, who created Patagonia. And one of the questions I wanted to start by asking you about is that Yvon is this leader who is a self-proclaimed dirtbag. He's a mountaineer. He is most comfortable kind of roaming in the wilds of Patagonia. And he's also insubordinate. You get into like his history of in the military. He does not like to be governed. So where did his ambition come from to also build an extremely successful business and kind of a game-changing business?
Yeah, well, thanks, Emma, for hosting this conversation, and to Steve and everyone for sticking around. I know it's a long day. Ambition is a word that I think he has a very fraught relationship with. And everything you said is right on. But it's important to know that he never set out to build a big company. It sort of happened by accident, and he had to make peace with it along the way. And so his ambitions, in as much as he has them, are to be away from people. Like the last place he'd ever want to be is a room like this, I'm sorry. He really did everything in his power to be in nature as much as possible, to be rock climbing and fishing. And those are the places where he drew his product inspiration. And when it came to actually watching this business grow, he had a fraught relationship with it along the way. And the one way to understand why he allowed the company to keep growing is because as Patagonia became a multi-million, multi-hundred million dollar business with thousands of people working for it, he felt a responsibility to take care of those people. And Patagonia only had 1 round of real mass layoffs in its career, and it was such a traumatizing experience to Chouinard and his family who ran the company that they never wanted it to ever happen again. And as a result, the company sort of kept getting bigger by virtue of just the momentum. And it's something that to this day, and that we spoke about at length during the reporting of this book, he's simply not comfortable with. If he could snap his fingers, in some ways, Patagonia wouldn't exist at all.
That's fascinating. Well, one thing I especially loved about this book, I don't know if all of you know this about David, but his last book was about Jack Welch, who David calls the man who broke capitalism. And it's sort of a portrait of corporate malfeasance, basically prioritizing the bottom line over people at every turn. And then you turned around and kind of looked at someone who represented the opposite. So I'm curious what your reporting on Patagonia and on Chouinard taught you about what enables a business leader to actually, over the course of a long and complicated career, keep their North Star and keep putting people over profits even when they're pulled toward doing the opposite.
Yeah, the Welch book and the Chouinard book sort of exist on opposite ends of sort of the spectrum of corporate values. And here I should just note, I mean, Dirtbag Billionaire, a lot of people hear that title and they think, oh, you must not like the guy. Like dirtbag's not a nice word. As you noted, Emma, he calls himself a dirtbag to this day because in the rock climbing community from which he came, dirtbag is actually the highest compliment. It refers to someone who's so unenamored with materialism that he's literally content to sleep in the dirt if it means he's that much closer to his next adventure, to his next climb. But when Chouinard actually heard the title of the book, he was very pissed off at me. Not because of the word dirtbag, but because of the word billionaire. The one thing he never wanted to be in his life, never wanted to be referred to, was a billionaire. And so that tension, I think, animates the whole history of the company. As for how he sort of maintained his North Star, I think that, at the end of the day, was the story I didn't know I was going to wind up telling in the book, but that really came through. And the way I've come to describe it is, from a very early moment in his life and business career, Chouinard and his team understood what they cared about. And those things were very simple. They wanted to run a responsible business. They wanted to use their profits to preserve the natural environment, and that meant large-scale land conservation. And they wanted to fund grassroots environmental activists. And they wanted to run sort of a company that is the kind of company that they would want to work at. Though you call them North Stars, that's not language that they used, but those values, which is language they used, they kept coming back to over and over again. And they were never perfect in the execution. And the story of the book is not one of like one grand decision. It's one of like 1,000 little decisions where they have to figure it out. But at the end of the day, I think the reason Patagonia, although it's a relatively small company, has such an outsized brand impact, such a big place in our collective imaginations, is because they kept doing the work. They kept coming back to those same values, and the values never changed. And in this kind of business environment, where, I mean, you and I write about business leaders all the time at the Times, and it feels like with every news cycle, political cycle, the values of a company and a leader can sort of blow with the wind. The values of Patagonia really haven't changed at all in more than 50 years.
It's so interesting that you bring that up. And I love that you said that Chouinard had that reaction, not to Dirtbag, but to Billionaire, because there's an amazing scene in the book where he makes it on the Forbes list, and he's really mad about it. And he's like calling people he works with to say, like, get me off this list, basically. I never intended to be this uber wealthy individual. So I'm curious, Chouinard has been consistent from the start of wanting to kind of prioritize the planet and prioritize his people above growth, and yet the company scaled. And you talk at so many interesting moments about how they toggled back and forth between the success of the business, the desire for quality products, and the desire to manage the growth. Where were the moments where that balance went astray, and what broke for them?
Yeah. And here it's important to note that, I mean, you've referenced a few times in the questions, this focus on the people. And in the book, I try to make clear that, I mean, Chouinard wanted to run a company that people wanted to work at, but he was never the engine that really, I would say, cared for the workers of Patagonia. That was his wife, Melinda. And Melinda and another woman, Chris McDivitt, play a huge role in this book. And Patagonia would not be the company that it is today without those two, even if they don't get a lot of the credit in the final telling of it. I try to change that in this narrative. And the people piece, I just want to stress here again, is complicated. Yes, you know, Yvon's book is called Let My People Go Surfing. And yes, there was some truth to that. You know, if the surf was really up in the early days, you could like walk away from your desk and go surf. Yes, there are still showers at the Ventura campus, and people still have some flexibility to take longer weekends if they want to do a trip. But Patagonia employees work really, really hard. And it is, at times, a very demanding and cutthroat place to work. And it's a place that has not always been a model and a paragon of sort of virtuous stewardship of its own people. And I will note this. I mean, the 2017 moment you noted, where he is on the Forbes list, led to this extraordinary act in 2022 when he renounces ownership of the company. But in doing so, he made a very deliberate choice not to share the wealth with his employees. These are some people who had worked there for 50 years at that point. And when you think about his priorities, I would argue that the well-being of his employees is a part of a matrix, but it is not the primary goal for that company or this manager.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's interesting because the book also gets into a succession battle, not his, that I think shows where some of that can go awry and where family and personalities can step on top of good intentions. I want to ask a question that I think might be of interest particularly to this room, which is that you and I have both written about how challenging this moment is for business leaders who have historically prioritized ESG. DEI is another category. Like, it is an incredibly high pressure moment for business leaders who over recent years were trying to lead in a way that they would describe as maybe values aligned.
Yeah.
Politically in particular, some might say it's even like feels like an impossible moment to do so. What can we learn from Chouinard's example? And I'm also curious, in the course of reporting this, did you ever worry like it comes down too much to singular leaders who are just built like no other and can therefore create these values-driven businesses? Is it replicable, or is it kind of about the force of personality?
Sure. Well, let's come back to that one. I mean, I think the first piece to note about what other companies can learn about sort of how Patagonia is showing up in this very complicated political moment is to recognize that those values that I said that they cared about starting 50 years ago are still the values by which they sort of make their decisions today. And there's a consistency there that, again, is really unique in the corporate world. What that means is when the Trump administration took over the first time, this was the first big article I wrote about Patagonia for the New York Times. They sued the president. I mean, this is not a company that is going to be a wallflower when it comes to expressing its political opinions. In 2017, Patagonia led a lawsuit against the Trump administration over its efforts to reduce the size of national monuments. At that moment, it went black on all its websites and put up a new image that said, "The president stole your land." And then Chouinard, who is a recluse, this is a guy who has avoided the spotlight his whole life. Last thing, as I noted, he wants to do is like be on a stage. He wants to be in the woods. He went on CNN to sort of go toe-to-toe with the administration. Since then, Patagonia has continued to be outspoken in its opposition, including to what this administration is doing. The current CEO, Ryan Gellert, is out there practically every week taking on not only the EPA for things like repealing the endangerment finding, but other business leaders for their kowtowing to this administration. So Patagonia has never been afraid to be political, and at this moment continues to speak out when almost every other brand has gone silent. I note, though, they have the freedom to do that because not only are they privately held, but they now have this structure that was put in place 3 years ago when Chouinard gave away the company that really insulates them from the pressures of a board, of public shareholders, et cetera. And so, yes, they are really outspoken right now, and I am quick to acknowledge, and you know as much because you're a business reporter too, not every company has that luxury. So I think the lesson there is, yes, on the one hand, they are really exceptional in some ways that I think are more about corporate governance than just about like a singular spark plug leader. But I do think that that focus on what are the couple things we care about and can we keep going back to those and using them as our North Stars or whatever they might be called in our decision-making process, that's something that every company, every leader can do.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that was particularly exciting in the book is when you describe the way that they set up this really unique succession plan, and how Chouinard was going to basically give away the company to the planet in a kind of singular move. And I remember when you wrote that story for the New York Times and it went super viral.
Yeah.
I remember this because I feel like my mom only calls me about like one New York Times story a year. And it was, she like called me and was like, have you read this story? So can you tell us about how you got that story?
Yeah.
And what was, you note in the book, other companies started to try and follow suit. What was the reaction like? What were you hearing?
Yeah, I mean, the way I got the story is Patagonia asked me to break the news. And so I worked with them. I interviewed Chouinard, members of the board, members of the family for months ahead of it. And then when I finally broke the news in September of 2022, it did go truly viral. I mean, I think it was the third most read story of the year after Trump taxes and the live blog of Queen Elizabeth's death. So there was massive interest. And that's ultimately, in part, what led me to write the book. As for what the reaction was, I mean, I think a lot of people responded to that story because we are so inured to the idea that business people and billionaires in particular are not to be trusted. And that even though business makes a case for being a force for good, so often it seems like they're doing quite the opposite. And so when this story came out that I think reaffirmed what a lot of people thought they knew about Patagonia, but sort of put meat on the bones, it was an opportunity to really have a much more fulsome dialogue about what is the potential for a for-profit corporation to have a positive impact in the world. And here was at least one example that wasn't perfect, and he's not perfect, and I don't say he's perfect in the book, but here's an example of how a company has figured out how it wants to show up and is doing its damnedest to do that in a way that makes an impact. And so that was, I think that was where the response came from. As for just like the nitty-gritty of the succession planning, we can get into the details if you want. But yeah, other companies have tried to explore how they can do something similar. I think there's elements of what Patagonia did that are probably going to make it somewhat unique. But there are plenty of other philanthropic business leaders, and I think we'll see more of them in the years ahead.
So a question related to that. New York City is on the verge of a mayoral election where the front runner is a Democratic socialist. And there's been a lot of exploration of what this race is maybe saying about the next generation's views on capitalism and business. Do you see in your own reporting and in your storytelling a generational divide in how receptive people are to this idea that business can do good? And have you met people whose minds were changed at all by some of this kind of reporting that you've done?
Well, first I'd note that, Mamdani has received a lot of flack for being like a democratic socialist or a communist or like whatever you want to call him. And everyone says he's anti-business. But, he went on the record a couple months ago saying, I respect some business leaders. And guess who he named?
Did he?
Yvon Chouinard was at the top of his list of business leaders who had earned his respect over the years. I think that was in the Financial Times. I think the question about a generational divide is a great one. And I'm going to say no. And the reason being, I know plenty of old people, and I would count myself among them, who are still optimistic and are still working hard to figure out how business can be a force for good. I also know tons of like young, amoral finance bros. So no, I don't think there's a generational divide. I think there's like a spiritual divide.
Interesting. I love that. I'm not sure. Yeah, I love that. You have to go like talk at a Mamdani rally and see what they say.
Let's go. Share a byline.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious, who are up and coming leaders in the business world who seem to you like they are in either the Chouinard mold or the Welch mold?
Ooh. I don't want to fully dodge the question, but I do try to avoid saying like so-and-so is just like Yvon Chouinard, because that's like saying like they're going to be like Michael Jordan. Like it sets the expectations very high. And Chouinard lived a singular life, and Patagonia is a singular company. And in the same way, it's a real insult to compare anyone to Jack Welch in my book, so I try not to do that. What I can say is that I see a lot of people wanting to be like Yvon Chouinard and Patagonia and realizing how hard it is. And what Chouinard told me over and over again is that the moment you have external shareholders, the moment you take VC money or private equity money, or you go public, God forbid, you are going to have a really hard time making good on your values, which is why, despite having the opportunity over and over and over to take outside capital, he always resisted it. He always said no. And it was because even though he was no corporate governance expert, he never graduated from college, he understood enough to know that if he sacrificed control, he would very quickly lose the ability to set the course for this company. On the Jack Welch side, I don't need to name names. Most of the business world at the end of the day is still, in my estimation, following the Jack Welch playbook, which is why I wrote a whole book about why I think it's been such a nefarious influence on corporate America. Short-termism still is the law of the land today.
Yeah, absolutely. And while I was reading this, I kept thinking, this book is such a perfect intersection of someone who has been leading coverage on the business world and on the climate world, and thinking about how those two can come together. I wanted to ask you about, you start out the book, you get into some of Chouinard's old writings and what his vision was, not just for business, but for the planet.
Yeah.
And then throughout the book, you really kind of plumb this tension between wanting to be a force for environmental good and also being something that puts more stuff into the world. Yeah. What's the net score on where Chouinard and Patagonia land in terms of, in your view, what their environmental impact was as, such a loud voice for environmental good and also a producer of so much stuff we all consume?
Yeah, you've homed in on the paradox at the center of this story. Yvon and Patagonia were on a mission to try to take care of the home planet, which is what they call Earth. And yet they were in a business that by definition takes a real toll. As I discussed, he was someone who always said he cared a lot about his people, and he never trusted his employees enough to give them equity. This was a company that supported grassroots environmental activism, but was on the receiving end of activist campaigns when it fell foul of its own high standards. It's a company that has said, it is trying to reduce mindless and needless consumption, and yet is like a brilliant marketing force that knows how to sell and move products. So the tensions and the paradoxes go on and on and on. And listen, if you ask Yvon, and good luck tracking him down. He doesn't own a cell phone, doesn't have an email address, and has never owned a computer. But when I asked him what he thought about like where the final ledger lay, he was really dissatisfied. He said we were cleaning fish he had caught that day at his kitchen sink in his log cabin in Wyoming. And I sort of asked him a version of this question. And he said, whatever circle of hell they reserve for the people with the largest carbon footprint, that's where I'm headed.
Oh my gosh.
Because he has this deep knowledge that, for all the good that one could argue he has done in the world, he also has created a company that's taken a huge toll on the planet that he cares so much about. And his own adventures with all the attendant CO2 emissions from all the planes he's been on in his life have had their little impact. And so he is, he's happy at this point in his life. He's 86 years old. He understands that Patagonia has served as a symbol for what the business community can do and the potential that I think is inherent in capitalism as being a possible force for good. And at the end of the day, because he had such high standards, he is also at a very deep level dissatisfied, which is why he's still pushing Patagonia to do the work.
I love that. Okay, I have to ask one last question, even though we're over time. What's like the most shocking detail you uncovered? Like, what was the thing that stopped you in your tracks while you were reporting?
Patagonia had a long and secret history as a military contractor.
So you have to read the book to find out more. Thank you so much, David. This was wonderful.
Thank you all.